"You're not in the will, Mother. Don't make this harder than it already is." Caleb's voice was cold and final, as if he were talking to a stranger, not the woman who had given him life. I stood at the doorway of the conference room, my hands still gripping the navy blue file case like a shield, while my two sons, Caleb and Miles, stood blocking the empty chair at the head of the table. The meeting room at Harrington and Bell was formally cold, with its high ceiling, wine velvet drapes, and oak table polished to a mirror that reflected my own rigid face. The air smelled of wood wax and black coffee, making my throat dry. "Immediate family only," Miles added, avoiding my eyes. Immediate family, those two words sounded like the click of a lock. I looked at the two men I once held in my arms, now standing as gatekeepers. I had thought nothing could make me feel suffocated at this age, but I was wrong. I drew a long breath, letting the cold air fill my lungs, and stepped fully into the room. Every other face there was the young associate, a few distant relatives, the secretary with a name tag that read A. Keating looked at me cautiously, as if my presence was a mistake. "I received a letter," I said softly but clearly, "from Harrington and Bell. Correct date, correct address." Caleb gave a small scoff. "They must have sent it by mistake." I opened my case and placed an envelope sealed with the Harrington and Bell insignia on the table. No one looked down. I continued, my voice steady. "B wanted me to be here." "Aunt B left a new will last fall," Miles replied, trying to sound gentle. "We were appointed to handle it." "She didn't have children," I reminded them, "and I'm her only sister." No one answered. I could feel every second of silence pressing on my chest like stone. Miss Keating looked down at the table, her fingers tapping lightly on a file before she murmured, "Your name isn't on the list for today's reading." I nodded, smiling faintly. "I know, but I didn't come here to make a scene." I opened my case again, took out a neatly clipped packet of papers, the top sheet marked with a faded notary stamp, and handed it to her. "Please deliver this to Mr. Sutton. I believe this document will clarify things." She hesitated, then stood, took the papers, and hurried toward the inner door. Caleb started to say something, but Miles placed a hand on his shoulder and whispered, "Wait." I sat down in the chair they had blocked, resting the file case on my lap, not as a shield this time, but as evidence. I wasn't trembling anymore. I didn't need anyone's permission. What I felt instead was a strange calm rising within me, the calm of someone who no longer fears. When the door opened again, Mr. Sutton entered, tall, gray-bearded, his coat dusted with paper lint, as if he'd stepped straight out of an old book. He looked directly at me. "Mrs. Whitaker, may I speak with you privately?" Caleb frowned. "This meeting is for family only." Mr. Sutton turned to him, his tone even. "And I think we're about to find out who really counts as family." No one said another word. I stood, straightened my collar, and followed him into the adjoining room, where the door closed softly behind us, like the quiet punctuation at the end of a long chapter. I didn't know where things would turn from here, but one thing I knew for sure. Today, I would not be shut out of my own place again. If this story reminds you of a time when you were pushed away from the seat that should have been yours, leave a comment to tell us where you're listening from, and subscribe to follow the next journey of Begin Again stories. You are not alone. The inner room was smaller than I expected, with only a counter high enough to reach my chest, no chairs, no windows, just the faint scent of cedar wood mixed with old paper and ink. Mr. Sutton closed the door behind us and turned to me with an expression both stern and quiet. "I didn't expect to see you here today, Mrs. Whitaker," he said, his voice light yet weighted like a verdict. I placed the file case on the counter, my hand still resting on the lid, not opening it. "I'm only doing what B asked," I replied. He nodded and pulled the stack of papers Miss Keating had brought in, turning each page carefully. I heard the soft rustle of paper and the ticking of the wall clock, steady and even, as if counting the beats of my entire waiting life. He stopped at the third page, his glasses sliding down the bridge of his nose. "Do you know what this document is?" "I do," I said, my voice sounding like someone else's. "It's the mutual will that B and I signed together in 2011, notarized, 2 witnesses, filed at the Chatham County office." He placed a hand on the corner of the document and nodded slightly. Correct. And the important part, he looked up at me, is that it was never revoked, at least not in your presence. I shook my head. No, she never spoke of revoking it. Even in her final years, when her memory wavered, B still remembered that she had signed it with me. She called it the pact between two sisters, saying it was her way of keeping faith alive longer than either of us would live. Mr. Sutton set the paper down, clasped his hands in front of him, and spoke slowly. Legally, that means any later revision, including the one your son submitted, has no validity unless made in the presence and agreement of both original signers. And in this case, there was none. I felt a weight rise in my chest, not because of the assets being discussed, but because of the two words he had just said. There was none. Mr. Sutton went on. Therefore, under the law, you are the sole heir of the entire estate, the historic house at Forsyth Park, the cottage on Tybee Island, and all investments and savings accounts. The preliminary total valuation is approximately $1.2 million. I heard the number as though it were in a foreign language. It didn't make me feel richer, only emptier. B was truly gone, and what remained were papers, numbers, and people counting them. Mr. Sutton paused, then asked, "Would you like me to inform the others right now?" I glanced toward the wooden door left slightly ajar, imagining Caleb standing there with crossed arms and Miles pretending to stay calm. I took a slow breath. No, let them hear it with everyone else. I want them to know not through my words, but through the truth. Mr. Sutton said nothing for a moment. His eyes softened, understanding something beyond the law. I worked with B for many years, he said quietly. She always believed in fairness, but she also used to say, fairness without witnesses is easily twisted. Today, I think you are the last witness of that faith. I smiled faintly, though what I felt wasn't joy, but release. I had carried that file for so long, not just to protect papers, but to protect a promise. Thank you, Mr. Sutton, I said softly. He nodded. When you return to the conference room, I'll read the will. They may react. Let me handle the legal side. All you need to do is stay silent. Sometimes the silence of the right person makes the guilty hear their own noise. I nodded, closing the file case. The latch clicked lightly, the sound echoing in the small room like the punctuation at the end of a life chapter. When I stepped back into the conference room, the air felt colder, but my hands no longer trembled. Caleb looked up, his eyes flickering between doubt and fear. Miles looked down, tapping his fingers against the edge of the chair. I walked to my seat and sat down, right where they had once blocked me. This time, I didn't ask permission. I didn't explain. I simply sat, straight-backed, calm, waiting for Mr. Sutton to step out with the paper in his hand. A new chapter of my life had begun not with a bell, but with a simple sentence. By law, Mrs. Elaine Whitaker is the sole heir. If you've ever had to stand outside a door where you were meant to sit, remember this. Sometimes all it takes is one rightful signature, one steady moment, to reclaim everything that was taken from you. Tell us where you're listening from, and subscribe to follow the next journey of Begin Again stories. You are not late, and you are not alone. When I returned home that afternoon, the Savannah sky had turned a pale bronze, sunlight spilling unevenly across the old stone pavement. I opened the door, the hinge creaked softly, and the house still smelled of menthol oil, waffles, and dry oak, the scent of time that only those who've lived long enough can recognize. I hung my coat, placed the Navy file case on the dining table, and stood still for a long while. The kettle was still in its usual spot, and the light above the sink flickered, the bulb that had been needing replacement for 2 months. I turned on the stove, poured the water, and listened to it rise to a boil. The steam tapped against the lid like the heartbeat of the house. Old habits, even when there's no one left to share tea with. The faint scent of black leaves pulled the memories back. I still remember the morning 23 years ago when Derek, my husband, left. A foggy winter morning, I heard the sound of glass shattering in the kitchen, ran in, and saw him collapsed on the floor, his hands still clutching the dish towel. His heart stopped before the ambulance arrived. When they covered him with a white sheet, I was still holding the phone, not knowing whom to call first. Randall and Trevor, no, Caleb and Miles stood beside me, wide-eyed like lost children. Caleb was 20, Miles 18. They didn't speak for a week. By the second week, they began discussing insurance, the car, and the mortgage, like apprentices pretending to be men. I thought that was how they were coping, so I let them be. I did everything, filled out forms, arranged the funeral, and sold Derek's boat that he had always promised to repaint. I still remember my hand shaking so hard during the transfer of papers that I tore the corner of the page. The young clerk smiled and said, "Your husband would be proud you're so strong." I smiled back, but in my head I thought, no, he'd be sad that I learned to brace myself too quickly. After the funeral, life stretched out like a spool of thread pulled too tight, no room left for knots or weakness. Caleb dropped out of college to become a broker, saying he wanted to help Mom get back on her feet. Miles took a job at a mechanic's shop with an old friend, saying he liked working with his hands. I told myself, as long as they lived decently, I could bear anything. But year after year, I began to see myself as just an observer in their lives. I helped Caleb when he lost money in his first deal, wrote him a check from my newly received pension. He promised to repay, but never mentioned it again. I helped Miles when his partner ran off with all the garage funds, withdrew from my savings so he wouldn't go bankrupt. No questions, no conditions, just a mother's instinct. Each time I told myself, think of it as investing in their happiness. I don't know if happiness pays interest, but the more I gave, the quieter the house became. Dinner for 4 became 2, then 1. Time taught me how to stay silent, how not to expect anyone to ask, "Are you okay, Mom?" Then Bea called one February day, her voice trembling. "I forgot the code to my bank safe. Do you remember it?" I froze. Bea, the woman who remembered every number, every birthday, every cent, couldn't recall 4 familiar digits. I drove 40 minutes to her house and found the medicine cabinet in the refrigerator and her indoor shoes on the kitchen table. "You must be worried," she laughed. "I'm just a little tired." But 2 months later, the doctor said, early-stage cognitive decline. I offered to have her move in with me. Bea refused, saying she wasn't ready to live like someone being cared for. But after the 3rd time she forgot to turn off the gas, I knew I had no choice. I prepared the room by the back garden, hung Derek's old painting on the wall, and placed a lavender vase by the bed. "I won't be any trouble," she said when she moved in. "I just need a quiet corner." I smiled. This house has never been quiet. I thought it was a joke, but later it became the opposite truth. The house grew quiet in a way that was frightening. I woke early, made tea for 2, read the newspaper, and heard Bea ask again, "What day is it today?" I'd answer, "Wednesday." 5 minutes later she'd ask, "What day is it today?" Each time I replied in the same gentle tone. I didn't count the number of times, only the look in her eyes when she realized she'd forgotten something again. It was so sad it silenced even my sighs. Caleb and Miles visited a few times, each stay lasting only hours. "You don't have to do this, Mom," Miles said. "Aunt Bea isn't your responsibility." I just smiled, saying nothing. Some things aren't responsibilities, they're meanings. When Bea grew weaker, I slept beside her bed, afraid she'd wander off at night. Once, during a storm, I found her sitting on the porch, her hair wet, saying she was waiting for our father to come home. I wrapped a towel around her shoulders, and she looked at me for a long moment before asking, "Are you my neighbor?" I smiled. "No, I'm the one who makes your tea every morning." Bea looked out at the garden and said, "That's nice. The one who makes the tea should inherit the flowers." I didn't understand then, but I remembered her words. Many years later, when I opened the navy envelope, I found she had truly written it into her will. When Bea passed, the house was so quiet I could hear the ticking clock. I sat by her bed, holding her hand for 2 hours before calling anyone, not out of shock, but to keep my final promise. To let her go in silence, without rush, without sirens, without the smell of antiseptic, only lavender, morning light, and me. I arranged a small funeral. A few neighbors came. Caleb read a eulogy like reading an email. Miles stood with his head down, hands in his pockets. They didn't cry, and neither did I. But after the service, they began asking about the estate, about paperwork. I let them handle it, thinking everything was clear. It wasn't until Caleb's phone call last week. "You don't need to attend the reading, Mom. Everything's been taken care of," that I understood. Sometimes people don't steal from you with a gun, but with the certainty that you won't dare to disagree. I sat in the kitchen, my hand resting on the Navy envelope. It had been there for 12 years, never reopened, always waiting for this day. I didn't bring it to prove I was right, but to keep B's promise. If they forget who I am, remind them who you are. And that's exactly what I did. If you've ever given your whole life to others until you forgot yourself, remember this: it's never too late to pour a cup of tea for yourself. Tell us where you're listening from, and subscribe to follow the next journey of Begin Again stories. Because some lives only truly begin when we stop giving without keeping anything for ourselves. The main conference room of Harrington and Bell was unnervingly quiet. Afternoon light filtered through the red velvet curtains, spilling across the long oak table like the last trace of a dying flame. Everyone was seated, and my chair still bore the faint imprint of my hands at the head of the table, the same place I had been blocked from that morning. The Navy file rested on my lap, but it was no longer a shield. It felt like a key, and I knew that once the door opened, nothing would be the same again. Mr. Sutton stood at the head of the table, glasses low on his nose, his voice deep and steady. "The reading of Mrs. Beatrice Rowan's will now begin. The estate includes 2 properties, several investments, and savings accounts in Chatham County." He opened a folder, glanced at Caleb and Miles, his face unreadable. "The document the 2 of you submitted last September has been determined to be a unilateral revision with no legal validity. According to the county records, the highest-standing legal document is the mutual will from 2011, signed by Mrs. Beatrice Rowan and Mrs. Elaine Whitaker, containing the clause that each is the lawful heir of the other unless revoked in the presence of both." A silence fell like a dropped cloth. Caleb raised an eyebrow and gave a short laugh. "That can't be right." "We submitted a notarized update." Mr. Sutton looked up. "I understand. But the law does not depend on what is newest, only on what is valid. And that document, sir, is not valid." Miles exhaled sharply, while I remained still, my hands intertwined, listening to the rhythm of my heartbeat blending with the sound of turning pages. "According to the 2011 will, Mr. Sutton continued, "the entire estate, including the house at Forsyth Park, the cottage at Tybee Island, and the investment accounts valued at $1.2 million, is lawfully transferred to Mrs. Elaine Whitaker." The words rang out clear, concise, slicing through the air like a blade. No one spoke. I heard the soft scrape of a chair, someone swallowing hard. Caleb stared at me, his face frozen, as if he had just heard a cruel joke. Miles kept his head down, hands clenched tight. "Mr. Sutton closed the folder and said calmly, "Any objections, if there are any, must be filed with the county court within 30 days. However, please note that this will is notarized, archived, and verified by the same legal office that certified the public copy in 2011. Any subsequent documents will be deemed invalid." I stayed silent, my gaze fixed on the window. Sunlight painted golden streaks across the floor like the slow breathing of the room. I heard Caleb speak, his tone low and tense. "What is this, Mother? How long have you known?" I looked at him calm. "Long enough not to be afraid anymore." Miles spoke next, his voice hoarse. "So, it all belongs to you?" "No, Miles," I said gently. "It belongs to the sister your mother cared for until the very end. I'm only keeping her promise." The air thickened, and the eyes turned toward me no longer held disdain but caution. I said nothing more. "Mr. Sutton concluded, "Therefore, according to the terms of the will, legal ownership of the entire estate is hereby transferred to Mrs. Elaine Whitaker. I will proceed with the necessary filings." He nodded slightly and left the room. I rose slowly. The chair that had once been blocked now sat empty, its worn leather warm beneath my touch. I ran my fingers along the backrest, then turned away. Behind me, I heard Caleb whisper, his voice cracking, "You planned this all along, didn't you?" I didn't answer. Some questions are best left for the wind to answer. As I stepped into the hallway, the last light of day streamed through the stained glass, bathing everything in a muted golden glow. I paused for a moment, seeing my reflection on the polished floor not stooped, but standing straight, defined. I knew then that the balance of power in that room had shifted. No one could ever again tell me I didn't belong there. They could keep the money, the justifications, but I held something greater, the truth. I stepped outside, and the Savannah wind carried the salt air from Tybee Island, cool and free. I gripped the handle of my case, and for the first time in years, what I carried no longer felt like a burden, but proof of a life lived rightly. If you've ever been dismissed, ever pushed out of your own story, remember this: sometimes justice doesn't arrive with applause. It arrives in the moment you sit down in the chair they once told you wasn't yours. Tell us where you're listening from, and subscribe to follow the next chapter of Begin Again Stories, because emotional justice begins the moment you stop bowing your head. That night, I couldn't sleep. Everything in the house was so silent I could hear the clock's rhythm pulsing through my veins. I sat by the window as moonlight slipped through the magnolia branches outside, scattering pale spots across the wooden floor. On the table lay B's old poetry book, Collected Whispers, the spine worn, a few pages still clipped together, untouched. On page 47, a faded underline, "Blood is memory, not possession." I read it again and again, feeling as if B were whispering it beside me. We were born 11 months apart, close enough that our mother used to joke we were 2 springs in 1 year. B was the radiant one, I was the quiet one. She loved loud music, parties, movement. I loved the small kitchen, morning tea, and the local radio. As children, B often skipped class and dragged me along, saying, "Sitting in a classroom is a waste of youth." I was the one waiting beside her, helping her copy notes before turning them in, afraid the teacher would scold her. We were opposites, but needed each other to stay balanced. Later, when our parents died in a federal highway accident, we had only each other left. B had just turned 18. I was 19. 2 girls, 1 old house, and too many unpaid bills. I remember that first night we slept on the living room floor amid piles of insurance papers, and B turned to me and said, "From now on, you plan, I'll talk. We'll be fine." And we were fine, though never easily. I became a teacher at the elementary school. B studied at night, worked as a secretary, and later joined the local radio station. She always said, "Having a voice means having the right to tell your story." Maybe that's why she never let anyone speak for her. I still remember the summer of 1979 when she sent me her first postcard from Greece. Her handwriting was neat. "The sky is as blue as your voice when you teach the children their first letter." Every trip she took, B brought home something strange: a little bell bracelet, a heart-shaped stone, a jar of pickled onions from Dublin. "To keep the house noisy," she'd say. "Silence is how a home dies slowly." When Derek proposed to me, B laughed and said, "You'll have a house and I'll have the world." I replied, "Your world will be lonely." She said, "Loneliness isn't scary. Losing freedom is." Many years later, I understood she was right. When B moved into my home after her diagnosis, I feared everything would fall apart. 2 opposite temperaments, 2 women who had lived apart for nearly 2 decades, now under the same roof. But strangely, the house became fuller. B still smelled of her old Guerlain perfume, still mumbled poems in the kitchen sometimes. Some mornings, as I made tea, she would sit by the window doodling on napkins, circles, flowers, and once she wrote a small line, "Don't let anyone rewrite your ending, May." She still called me May, the name only she ever used. As her memory faded, those lines were what she remembered best. One evening, while I was brushing her hair, B looked at me through the mirror and said slowly, each word etched into the air, "When I'm no longer clear-minded, don't let anyone speak in my name to change what I chose. People forget their promises easily when money's involved, May. Remember, loyalty needs a signature too." I said nothing, just held her hand. That was the last time B was lucid enough to give advice. After that, every time I signed a document, I wrote slowly, as if signing for both of us. Last year, during B's final spring, I took her out to the back garden. The lavender was in bloom. B looked at the sky and smiled, faintly but bright. If I forget everything, remind me through the smell of flowers. I don't need to remember it all, only who I trusted. I smiled as tears streamed down my face, and when she passed, I placed a small bundle of lavender in her hands, along with a short note. I still remember. The story between two sisters didn't end with death, it ended with a promise, a vow not to let anyone steal faith. That is why I'm here today, late in life, protecting not the assets but the pact between two women once deemed fragile, but who loved in the strongest way by keeping their word. I closed the poetry book, turned off the light, but before leaving the table, I wrote on a small note and stuck it beside B's framed photo. The one who makes the tea will always inherit the flowers. If you've ever had someone who taught you what trust truly means, send them a message, whether they are here or gone. And if this story touched you, tell us where you're listening from and subscribe to follow the next chapter of Begin Again Stories. Because sometimes, the greatest legacies aren't kept in safes, they live in the final words of someone who once loved you. The next morning, Savannah's sky was draped in light rain, droplets sliding down the window frame like trembling handwritten lines of memory. I sat in Mr. Sutton's law office, holding a cup of hot black coffee, the steam blurring half of my reflection in the glass. Across from me, he was reviewing each page with his silver fountain pen, slow and deliberate, the kind of man who didn't need many words, only the quiet certainty that inspired trust. "Which clause would you like to start with?" he asked, his voice even as the rain. I answered without hesitation, "I want to lock the door, both literally and figuratively." He raised an eyebrow. "Lock the door?" "Legally," I said. "I want to make sure no one but me can touch this estate. Not Caleb, not Miles, not through power of attorney, not through some title of temporary management, not through a polite smile." Mr. Sutton gave a faint smile, as if he had been expecting that line. "We can create a restricted access clause," he said. "Any individual or representative not explicitly authorized will be denied access to accounts, records, or any fixed assets. Violations will result in civil action." He paused, his expression serious. "Are you certain?" I nodded. "I've given away the keys to my life long enough. It's time to keep one for myself." I looked down at the table, the spread of documents like a map each line, a road leading toward late-found freedom. "And I want to establish a trust," I added. "A living trust. Not for my two sons, but for someone who still understands the word family." Mr. Sutton opened his notebook, jotting down notes. "Name of the beneficiary?" "Clara Whitlow," I said, smiling slightly. "My grandniece, 27, works at the city library. She visits every 2 weeks, never asks about money, only brings lemon cake and time." He nodded. "I'll prepare the clause. A portion of the estate or all of it?" "Just enough," I replied. "Enough so she'll never have to choose between her dreams and rent. Enough to remind the next generation that kindness still holds value." As he typed, the sound of the keys blended with the rain outside, forming a steady rhythm like the ticking of a clock starting over. "And your two sons?" he asked. "I want a separate clause," I said calmly. "If they attempt to contest, litigate, or interfere with any part of this estate, even a single line, they forfeit all rights to any inheritance from me. No warning, no apology." He looked at me, eyes glinting with a hint of admiration. "You want a no-contest clause?" I nodded. "Yes, because people only learn boundaries when they meet consequences." When everything was complete, Mr. Sutton slid the folder toward me. "One final matter. Would you like to name a contingent heir, in case Miss Whitlow declines or passes before you?" I stayed quiet for a moment, then shook my head gently. "No, I trust she'll use it well. I won't write detours into faith." I signed each page. My handwriting was firm, unshaken. Mr. Sutton said softly, "You know, most people sign with fear. You sign like someone unlocking something." I smiled. "That's exactly what it is." When I stepped outside his office, the rain had stopped. I stood under the awning, inhaling the damp air mixed with the scent of pine. In my hand was the new file, less than half an inch thick but heavy as a lifetime of endurance. I knew my sons wouldn't stay quiet for long. They would call, write letters, make excuses about just wanting to talk. But this time I had boundaries written in ink, sealed by law and locked by self-respect. That evening, sitting in the kitchen, I opened a drawer and took out Bee's old notebook. In the middle of a page she had once written, "Don't let anyone sign for you again." I smiled, touching the words, and wrote beneath them, "Sister, this time, I signed for us both. If you've ever had to learn to lock a door that others kept forcing open, remember, that's not selfishness. It's the beginning of peace." Tell us where you're listening from, and subscribe to follow the next chapter of Begin Again stories. Because some locks aren't meant to keep others out, but to keep yourself whole. The doorbell rang at exactly 9:04 a.m., 3 short, precise chimes, as if he were tapping on the heartbeat of the house itself. I glanced through the curtain at the black sedan parked diagonally across the walkway, headlights still on, engine running. Caleb had never known how to park straight, not even as a child. The boy who argued with his teacher at 10 was now 35, wearing leather shoes and the confidence of someone accustomed to forgiveness. I didn't rush to open the door. I let him wait a minute, 2, 3. Then I turned the lock. "Hi, Mom," Caleb said, his smile paper-thin. "I was nearby and thought I'd stop by to see how you're doing." "Nearby?" I asked flatly. "On your way back from the lawyer's office." He hesitated, then laughed like someone caught but unashamed. "You're as sharp as ever. Good thing we're not in court, or I'd lose." I hadn't invited him in, but Caleb stepped over the threshold like someone who owned the place. The scent of expensive cologne lingered on me, which I'd never liked, because it always tried to mask something else. Emptiness. He looked around the house, hands in his pockets, eyes sweeping over each frame, each object as if assessing their worth. "The house looks the same," he said. "You've kept it well. You know, Mom, Miles and I were only trying to make sure everything is handled reasonably. No one wants you stressed at your age. I poured tea but didn't offer any." "Reasonably?" I repeated. "Yes. Paperwork, assets, and legalities can get complicated. You don't need to burden yourself. I just want to help you avoid mistakes, ones that could cause you trouble." I set the cup down and looked straight at him. "Trouble like submitting a falsified will under the name of a dead woman?" He chuckled softly, shifting to that tone as light as rain. "Mom, falsified sounds so harsh. We just updated a few details. The lawyer even said adjustments are possible if the family agrees. Everything can be fixed, right?" "Right," I said, "except morality." His smile tightened. "You're misunderstanding me. I just think, after everything, you don't need to deal with such a big house alone. Miles is busy, and I live far away. I just want to make sure everything is used properly. You know, if you'd like, I can help sell off some properties. We can split the profit. Everyone's happy." "Everyone's happy," I repeated, "except the dead and the one who kept her promise." Caleb tilted his head, his eyes glinting, the kind of look that had once helped him lie his way into being believed. "Mom, we're talking about paperwork, not morality. I'm just trying to protect you from legal trouble. I don't want anyone taking advantage of you." I gave a short laugh. "Like the time you made me sign over the deed to my house?" He froze, his expression stiffening. "That was years ago. I just didn't understand then. I was trying to make things simpler for you." "Simpler for me?" I said. "Or for you?" Silence. For a few seconds, the ticking clock on the wall was as loud as a gavel. Caleb smiled again, but this time it stretched thin, like an overpulled string. "You're angry," he said. "No, Caleb," I replied. "I'm awake." He took a step back but tried to keep his voice calm. "You don't have to be so tense. If you trust me, we can settle this peacefully. All you have to do is share the original documents, and we'll handle the rest. Save you the effort." "And then?" I asked. "You send me monthly reports like an allowance check?" He sighed, feigning patience. "You're making this bigger than it is. I just want to keep the peace." I looked at him for a long moment, seeing the man who had once been a boy, promising never to make his mother sad. That promise had died the same year I signed away my first home. Do you know what you're best at, Caleb? I said slowly. You use language to make people feel wrong when you are. He stiffened, lips parting, but no sound came out. I stood, lifted the cold tea, and poured it into the sink. You want to help me? Learn to be silent. He looked at me like he no longer recognized the woman standing before him. You're changing, he said quietly. No, Caleb, I whispered back, I'm returning. When he left, I watched through the window the black sedan speeding off into the rain, its tire tracks dark against the wet brick path. I took a deep breath, feeling as though a storm had passed but couldn't touch me anymore. At my age, I don't need to win every argument. I just need to ensure that no one else speaks on my behalf. If you've ever met someone who used sweet words to erase their own wrongs, remember, silence has its own volume, and sometimes it's the only sound that makes a manipulator listen. Tell us where you're listening from, and subscribe to follow the next chapter of Begin Again Stories. Because some confrontations don't need shouting, only a mother steady enough to say no without shaking. The rain had stopped long ago, but the Savannah afternoon still felt damp, suspended somewhere between forgiveness and caution. I was wiping the kitchen counter when I heard a sound on the porch, 3 knocks, not firm like Caleb's, but hesitant, clumsy, as if the person outside wasn't sure whether to knock at all. I pulled back the curtain. Miles. No suit, no polished car, just an old oil-stained jacket and soaked shoes. He stood there, hands in his pockets, eyes waiting. I opened the door but didn't smile. Hi, Mom, he said softly. Am I bothering you? Depends, I replied, stepping aside. Come in, if you've brought something more real than an apology. He nodded, stepped inside, and set his cap on the table, the steam from his damp shoulders rising in the afternoon light. The house was so quiet that only the ticking clock and the drip of water from his coat could be heard. I made tea, a habit I couldn't shake, sometimes just to fill the silence. When I placed the cup in front of him, Miles spoke quietly. Mom, I didn't come for money. I know I owe you more than that, but this... He pulled a wrinkled envelope from his jacket pocket and laid it on the table. I opened it. Inside was a stack of papers, 11 pages, lined and annotated carefully all the amounts I'd ever lent him over the past 15 years. $850 for the transmission repair, $2,000 for March rent, $50 for the tow truck that year. And on the last line, in his uneven handwriting, total $14,230. I haven't paid, but I remember. I looked at him. You kept track of every amount? Because I didn't want to forget, even when I pretended I had, he said, eyes downcast. I have nothing but my word, but I want to start paying it back, even if it's little by little. I touched the corner of the paper, feeling the damp ink seep into my fingertips. I didn't feel moved or resentful, just deeply tired. Miles, I said, what I needed was never money. He looked up, his eyes as wet as the sky outside. I know, but I owe you silence too. The day you cared for Aunt Bee, I said the worst thing I've ever said, that it wasn't your responsibility. I want to take that back. I said nothing. The scent of citrus tea spread warmly through the room, yet my wrists still felt cold. I know Caleb came here, he said finally. I'm not defending him, but I understand why he is the way he is. You taught both of us kindness, but we never learned boundaries. I looked at him, seeing the fatigue in his slouched shoulders. He wasn't like Caleb, he didn't fake strength or hide behind explanations. But he was still my son, and like his brother, he had once believed I would always endure. If you really want to make it right, I said, don't protect your brother. Don't let loyalty blind you to what's right. He nodded. I don't want to take sides. It's not about sides, I said firmly. It's about character. He went quiet, then spoke softly. I won't be part of the lawsuit. Caleb might call it betrayal, but I've lived long enough to know honesty isn't a sin. I nodded slightly. In the quiet of the house, the clock ticked evenly, like the heartbeat of someone being revived. Miles gently pushed the envelope toward me. I'll send it little by little. You don't have to count it, just know I'm trying. I looked at him and spoke in a slow voice. Don't send it. Keep it as a reminder. Redemption isn't paid with money, but with the way you live differently. He smiled faintly, a smile not young but sincere. "I'll remember." "I know you will." When he stood, his wet shoes left faint marks on the floor, not heavy, just soft, like the memory of those who once failed but dared to return. He said goodbye and stepped onto the porch. The sun was breaking through, the last drops of rain glinting like shattered glass. I watched him go, my heart not lighter but quieter. Some confrontations don't require shouting, they simply need two people telling the truth for the first time. I tucked the envelope into a drawer, between B's will and the legal documents, 3 layers of memory, 3 kinds of responsibility, but only one key: awareness. If you've ever forgiven without receiving an apology, remember emotional justice isn't about who pays, but about you no longer waiting. Tell us where you're listening from, and subscribe to follow the next chapter of Begin Again stories, because some debts don't need repayment, only redemption. The morning after Miles left, Savannah returned to its familiar quiet, the kind of silence that no longer frightened me but felt like the pause between 2 breaths. I sat at the kitchen table, the legal file open before me, beside it the navy blue envelope still unsealed. I knew what was coming. Caleb never accepted defeat without noise. And as expected, among the morning mail was a thick envelope bearing the logo of Sterling and Doyle, the kind of envelope heavy, not with paper but with intent. Inside was a threat written in the language of politeness. "Dear Mrs. Whitaker, our client, Mr. Caleb Whitaker, has reason to question the validity of the 2011 will. We request your cooperation in providing the original and any related documents to avoid entering litigation." I folded the letter and set it down, neither trembling nor angry, only feeling the cold weight beneath my feet, like standing on stone. Then I turned on the kettle. When the water began to boil, I picked up the phone and called Mr. Sutton. He answered on the second ring. "I just received a letter," I said. "Sterling and Doyle?" "Yes." "Don't worry," he replied, calm as ever. "They'll try intimidation before stepping into court. I've already filed authentication of the original will, along with supporting evidence. They have no standing to win." I hung up, but my mind didn't rest. Not out of fear of losing the estate, but because I knew Caleb would try to turn B into evidence of incapacity. And I couldn't let that happen. I stood and walked to the wooden cabinet in the hallway where I still kept the old metal box, its paint chipped but its lock firm. Inside were things few knew I had kept: memos, handwritten letters, and a thick set of B's journals spanning the last 10 years of her life. Each one was numbered, her handwriting leaning right, sharp and orderly. I opened the volume from 2011, the year we signed the mutual will. On the first page, B had written, "Today, May and I did the right thing, not for money but for peace of mind. I want her to have the house, and I'll have the promise. We trust each other, and that's enough." I kept reading, each page like blood flowing backward into the heart. In 2015 she wrote, "My memory sometimes slips, but my feelings remain whole. If one day I forget who I am, May will remember. And I trust her more than any lawyer in this life." I stopped at the last entry from 2018, the handwriting shakier but still clear. "If they say I am weak, let my words answer. I have never signed anything I didn't understand." I folded the page and sat still, listening to the wind sweep across the porch. It wasn't just a journal, it was testimony. And I knew the battle ahead was no longer about money or property, but about memory, about the right to believe that the old woman they doubted had lived lucidly to her last moment. I called Mr. Sutton back. "I have more evidence," I said. "B's journals, dated, signed, clear." His voice deepened. "Good. We'll use her own words to answer them. The court always trusts handwriting when consistency is proven." I smiled. "They want to prove my sister lost her mind. But these pages prove the opposite, that only greed makes people lose theirs." That afternoon I went to the print shop, requesting each page be copied, laminated, numbered, and labeled. "Journal of Beatrice Rowan, evidence of cognitive competence and voluntary intent." The clerk asked softly, "Legal documents, ma'am?" I nodded. "Documents of justice." On the drive home, I remembered something B once said when we were young. They can take your words, but not your writing. She said it after a radio editor cut her mid-broadcast. That day she just laughed and said, "They can mute the mic, but I still have my pen." That evening, I spread all the copied journals across the table, arranging them by year, feeling as if I were preparing a battlefield not with weapons but with memory. I typed the preface for the new case file. The following pages demonstrate the clarity, voluntariness, and intent of the testator of a valid will. Any claim suggesting the individual lacked mental capacity is without basis. Let her own language testify. When I typed the last word, I looked up the room dim in the lamplight, yet I could see B's face in my mind, smiling faintly, nodding. The next morning, I brought the entire set to the post office, sending express copies to the courthouse and Mr. Sutton's office. In the sender field, I signed clearly, Elaine Whitaker, legal representative and executor of the estate of Beatrice Rowan. For the first time in years, my hand didn't shake as I wrote my name, because for the first time I wasn't representing someone else, I was protecting us both. If anyone has ever tried to rewrite your story, remember, sometimes the strongest act of defiance isn't shouting, it's letting your pen say what they can't deny. Tell us where you're listening from, and subscribe to follow the next chapter of Begin Again Stories. Because some battles can only be won through memory and through the handwriting of the one who taught you what honesty truly means. The courtroom of Chatham County was smaller than I had imagined. Not the grand halls from movies, but a modest wooden room, old chairs, the mingling scent of paper and stale coffee. I sat beside Mr. Sutton, my hands clasped in my lap, while Caleb sat across the aisle, his suit pressed, his hair combed neatly, his eyes still calculating but, for the first time, showing a trace of fear. Not fear of the law, but fear of being seen for who he truly was. In front of us, the judge, a middle-aged woman with prematurely silver hair and eyes that left no room for deceit, glanced between us and spoke, her voice clear as water sliding down glass. "We are here to determine the validity of the will signed in 2011 between Mrs. Beatrice Rowan and Mrs. Elaine Whitaker. Plaintiff, Mr. Caleb Whitaker, you may proceed." Caleb stood, his tone carefully controlled. "Your Honor, I believe that at the time of signing my Aunt Mrs. Rowan was no longer of sound mind to fully comprehend her legal actions. We have reason to suspect undue influence from the beneficiary." Mr. Sutton said nothing yet, simply sliding a folder toward the judge, waiting his turn. She nodded and turned her gaze to me. "Mrs. Whitaker, does your counsel have a response?" Mr. Sutton rose, his voice deep and steady. "Your Honor, we have clear evidence demonstrating that Mrs. Rowan was entirely competent at the time of signing. The proof does not come from hearsay, but from her own handwriting, her journals, letters, and notarized statements." He opened the folder, drew out a copy of the journal, and read aloud, "If they say I am weak, let my words answer. I have never signed anything I did not understand." The room fell silent. I saw the judge pause her note-taking, her eyes narrowing slightly. Mr. Sutton continued, "Mrs. Rowan was not only aware but foresaw this very situation. We also have a certificate from her neurologist, dated the same year, confirming no signs of cognitive impairment." He handed over the document. The judge flipped through the pages, then turned to Caleb. "Mr. Whitaker, do you have any counter-evidence?" Caleb swallowed hard and pulled a few sheets from his briefcase. "We have email correspondence between Mrs. Rowan and a neighbor in which she appeared confused." The judge glanced briefly. "These emails are unsigned and unverified. Do you have anything else?" Caleb's lips tightened. "No, Your Honor, but—" "There are no buts in evidence, Mr. Whitaker," she interrupted. "The court does not deal in emotion, it deals in truth." Mr. Sutton leaned toward me, whispering, "Just breathe. We're fine." I nodded faintly, my eyes on the wooden table, where sunlight streamed through the window, forming a golden seam like a thread stitching two generations together. When the judge finally spoke, "The court declares the 2011 will valid and all later revisions void. The plaintiff's claims are dismissed. I did not feel joy, only the quiet lifting of a long-settled dust." Caleb slumped into his chair, fists clenched, eyes fixed on me as if he couldn't understand how he'd lost. But I didn't look back. Winning and losing no longer mattered to someone who had spent a lifetime learning how to stand tall. Mr. Sutton nodded to the judge, gathered the documents. When we stepped out of the courtroom, the hallway glowed with light, our footsteps echoing evenly, and I thought of Bea. She would have smiled, that half-wry, half-proud smile, and said, "See, May, you won with words, not volume." Outside the courthouse, Caleb caught up to me, his voice unsteady. "Mom, I didn't think it would go this far." I stopped and turned, sunlight falling across his face, the face that had once softened all my anger. "No, Caleb," I said slowly. "You just thought everything would always go your way. Now you know not everyone who stays silent is weak." His mouth opened, then closed again, eyes cast down. "So what do you want from me now?" "Nothing. I already have peace. You can keep what's left. The lesson." He bowed his head, his polished shoes reflecting the sky. As he walked away, I saw the figure of my once tall son shrink along the wide path. The real fall of winners and losers doesn't happen when the verdict is read, but when they realize for the first time that truth doesn't need their belief to exist. I stood still for a long moment, then turned toward the sunlit street. March in Savannah was beginning to bloom, dogwoods white along the corner, and I realized justice is never loud. It only waits for those patient enough to walk past the voice of fear. If you've ever been underestimated for not reacting, remember, silence isn't defeat. Sometimes, it's the loudest victory there is. Tell us where you're listening from, and subscribe to follow the next chapter of Begin Again stories. Because some people only truly fall when they learn that trust can't be manipulated with words, only measured by character. That afternoon, sunlight poured into the kitchen like liquid honey, gentle and patient. I brewed tea, the scent of mint drifting through the house now finally quiet after so many months of storm. On the table lay a cream-colored envelope, thick and soft, sealed with red wax. It was not legal papers, but something I had spent 3 nights writing. A letter, not for the court, not for the lawyer, but for Lily. Lily wasn't my biological daughter, but Bea's niece, the young woman I had chosen to trust, to give the real inheritance to, not money, but responsibility for kindness. I wrote to Lily not as someone leaving wealth behind, but as someone who once made the mistake of staying silent for too long. I began the letter simply, "This is not a reward, this is recognition." I told Lily that for most of my long life, I believed patience meant waiting for others to understand you, that kindness meant sacrificing without asking, and that family meant blood ties always outweighed what was right. Then I told her that all of those things were only half true. I wrote, "Never let anyone tell you that you have to shrink yourself to keep the peace. You have the right to say enough, even to the ones you love." Because sometimes, real compassion doesn't lie in staying quiet, but in refusing to let the wrong continue. I remembered the first time Lily came to the house, bringing lemon cake and a shy smile, saying, "I don't know if you like sweets, but I think everyone needs a little sourness to stay awake." I laughed, and from then on, every 2 weeks she came, on time, never late, never empty-handed. While everyone else came to help me sort through my assets, Lily came to listen to stories of Bea, to the years when it was just the two of us and faith that kept us together. Not once did she mention money, property, or being included in anything. Maybe that's why I knew she was the right one to pass the true legacy to. I wrote in the letter, "I chose you not because you are perfect, but because you came without asking. You remind me of Bea, who once said, 'The one who makes the tea always deserves to inherit the flowers.' Think of this as a seed, not a gift." I folded the letter, sealed the envelope, and wrote her name on the front, Lily Whitlow, keeper of the little light. When Lily arrived, dusk was just settling. She knocked as always, 3 soft taps. I opened the door and saw her young face glowing in the last light of day. "Are you doing okay?" she asked, still holding the bag of cake. "I am," I smiled, "and about to be even better." We sat at the table, drinking tea, talking about small things, the neighbor's cat, the library's spring party, how the dogwoods were blooming early this year. When I handed her the envelope, Lily looked up, surprised. "What's this, ma'am?" "A thank you," I said. "But not for what you've done for me, for reminding me I can still believe in someone." She held the envelope, not opening it, just holding it carefully as if afraid to crease it. "You don't need to thank me, I interrupted gently, "came and stayed. Sometimes that's enough." She was silent for a moment, then said softly, "You know, I used to be afraid of being forgotten. But then I met you, and I realized maybe some people don't need to be remembered because they never truly disappear." I looked at her, my heart softening. "Then remember this," I said. "If one day someone tries to make you believe your kindness is weakness, read that letter again. It's not to praise, it's to remind." When she left, I stood at the door watching. The sunset brushed her hair in copper light, and for the first time in years, I felt I had completed a circle not of power but of faith. I closed the door and leaned against the wall, feeling lighter, as if I had finally set down a bag of sand I'd been carrying for decades. On the table, her teacup still sat, steam faintly rising like the trace of a gentle presence that never needed to announce itself. I thought if Bea were here, she would smile and say her usual line, "The world doesn't need more winners, it needs people who keep their promises." I looked up at the photo of the two of us on the shelf, light slanting across the frame, and whispered, "I did it, Bea. If you've ever felt that your kindness was overlooked, remember it was seen, even if by only one person. And sometimes, one person is enough to begin again." Tell us where you're listening from, and subscribe to follow the final chapter of Begin Again Stories. Because some letters aren't written to say goodbye, but to remind us that faith still has room to bloom. Early the next morning, Savannah was shrouded in a thin layer of mist, like a forgotten wool scarf on the steps. I woke up early, brewed mint tea, and sat by the window, watching as the first light touched the cream-colored wall. A sparrow tapped gently against the eaves, and I realized, for the first time in months, the house was completely still. No calls from lawyers, no threatening letters, no heavy footsteps on the floor. Just me, the steam of tea, and the quiet of someone who has walked through storms and no longer fears the rain. On the table was the teacup Lily had left the previous day, with a faint lipstick mark on the rim, like a soft memory. I touched the envelope she had left behind. She'd written a few more lines after leaving, in purple ink. "You taught me that kindness doesn't mean silence. I'll carry that for the rest of my life." I smiled, feeling as if Bea had just winked at me from her photo on the wall. I stood, opened the window, and let the wind in, carrying with it the scent of damp earth, ripe oranges from the garden, and the fragrance of an ordinary morning I once thought would never return. At my age, I no longer need anyone to validate justice, because true justice doesn't live in courtrooms. It lives in the first night you sleep soundly, without needing to defend yourself. I stepped onto the porch, tea in hand, and sat in the wooden chair Bea had painted back in 2002. The paint had peeled from the armrest, but the chair was still steady, just like the way we once held each other through hard seasons. I opened a new journal, the first page still blank, and wrote the first line. Today I'm not starting over. I'm just continuing, but this time with myself. I paused, listening to the distant sound of the river flowing through the city, the church bells striking 8, the wind rustling like a late blessing. There was no resentment left inside me, only a gentle space, like where a knife had been removed and left a healed scar. I thought of Caleb not with anger, only with hope that he would learn no one truly wins when they trade blood for advantage. I thought of Miles, hoping he would keep his promise to live differently. And I thought of Lil, the one who would write her life forward without repeating the mistakes of those before her. Everything had fallen back into place, as if time itself had patiently pieced the fragments together, waiting only for me to sit still and see it finished. I set the teacup down and took a deep breath. No more smoke, only warmth. No more victories, only truth. I knew I had kept my promise to Bea to hold on to the light, even if just one flicker remained. As sunlight filled the trees, I heard myself whisper, "Everything's all right." The words weren't meant for anyone, but they rang clearly inside me, light and deep, like the quiet click of a door closing gently after a lifetime of storms. If this story touched you, Tell us where you're listening from, and subscribe to follow the subsequent journeys of Begin Again stories. Because sometimes, happiness doesn't come from starting over, but from the moment you sit down, pour a cup of tea, and realize you are awake, and you are still here,